War of the Sixth Coalition. The French, pursued by the Russians, withdrew from most of Poland and Prussia over the winter of 1812–13, while both sides rebuilt their forces. Sweden and Prussia declared war on France in March 1813. In April, Napoleon assumed command of an army of 200,000 troops and defeated the coalition at Lutzen and Bautzen. Britain formally joined the coalition in June, followed by Austria in August, but the Allies were again defeated in the Battle of Dresden, August 1813. The coalition, however, had a growing advantage in infantry, cavalry, reserves, and armaments. In the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, the coalition was victorious at Leipzig in October. Although coalition casualties were 54,000 men, the French lost 38,000 killed or wounded and 15,000 taken prisoner. Up to 50,000 more were lost to death, illness, and desertion during the French retreat to the Rhine. The Frankfurt proposals were peace terms offered by the coalition in November 1813, under which Napoleon would remain emperor, but France would be reduced to its natural frontiers. That meant that France would retain control of Belgium, Savoy, and the west bank of the Rhine, while withdrawing from Spain, Holland, Italy, and Germany. Napoleon did not accept the terms, and the Allies crossed the Rhine into French territory on January 1, 1814. Wellington's British forces had already crossed the Pyrenees into southwestern France. In northeastern France, Napoleon led about 70,000 troops against a coalition army of 200,000. After a defeat at La Rothière, the French won a series of victories in February which induced the coalition to offer peace on the basis of France's 1791 frontiers. Napoleon, however, decided to fight on. After a series of battles in March, the Allies forced Napoleon to retreat at the Battle of Arcis-sur-Aube, 20–21 March. The coalition then moved towards Paris, whose defense was under the command of Joseph Bonaparte. On March 29th, a coalition army of 200,000 began their attack on the Belleville and Montmartre heights. Empress Marie-Louise fled Paris that evening with her son, the King of Rome. With an army of only 38,000 to defend the capital, Joseph authorized the French Marshal Auguste de Marmont to capitulate on March 31st. The following day, the Allies accepted Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord as head of a provisional government. On April 2nd, the Senate deposed Napoleon. Meanwhile, Napoleon was in Fontainebleau with an army of 40,000 to 60,000. He contemplated a march on Paris, but, on April 4th, his senior commanders persuaded him to abdicate in favor of his son, with Marie-Louise as regent. Tsar Alexander, however, demanded an unconditional abdication, and Napoleon reluctantly complied on April 6th. In his farewell address to the soldiers of the Old Guard on April 20th, Napoleon said, "Soldiers of my Old Guard, I have come to bid you farewell. For 20 years you have accompanied me faithfully on the paths of honor and glory. With men like you, our cause was not lost, but the war would have dragged on interminably, and it would have been a civil war. So I am sacrificing our interests to those of our country. Do not lament my fate. If I have agreed to live on, it is to serve our glory. I wish to write the history of the great deeds we have done together. Farewell, my children." Exile to Elba. With the Treaty of Fontainebleau of April 11, 1814, the Allies exiled Napoleon to Elba, an island of 12,000 inhabitants in the Mediterranean, 10 kilometers, 6 miles, off the Tuscan coast, where they made him sovereign. The following night, Napoleon attempted suicide with poison he had carried after nearly being captured by the Russians during the retreat from Moscow. Its potency had weakened with age, however, and he survived to be exiled, while his wife and son took refuge in Austria. He was conveyed to the island on HMS Undaunted and disembarked at Porto Ferraio on May 4, 1814. In the first few months on Elba, he drew up plans for administrative reforms, road and building works, and improvements to the island's mines and agriculture, but results were limited by lack of funds. When Napoleon learned that Josephine had died in France on May 29th, he was distraught and locked himself in his room for 2 days. Napoleon understood that the French King Louis XVIII was unpopular. Realizing that his wife and son would not be joining him in exile, cut off from the allowance guaranteed to him by the Treaty of Fontainebleau, and aware of rumors he was about to be banished to a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean, Napoleon escaped from Elba in the brig Inconstant on February 26, 1815, with about 1,000 men and a flotilla of 7 vessels. 100 days. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon and his followers landed on the French mainland at Golfe Juan and headed for Grenoble through the foothills of the Alps, taking the route now known as Route Napoleon. The 5th Regiment intercepted him just south of Grenoble on March 7th. Napoleon approached the battalion alone and called to them, "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish." The soldiers responded with, "Vive l'Empereur," and joined Napoleon's men. 6 days later, 5,000 troops under Michel Ney, who had boasted that he would bring Napoleon to Paris in an iron cage, also joined Napoleon. On March 13th, the powers at the Congress of Vienna declared Napoleon an outlaw. 4 days later, Great Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia each pledged to put 150,000 men into the field to end his rule. Louis XVIII, however, fled Paris for Belgium in the early hours of March 20th after realizing that he did not have enough reliable troops to oppose Napoleon. Napoleon entered Paris that evening. Napoleon appointed a government and introduced constitutional changes which were approved by plebiscite in May. A Chamber of Representatives was also indirectly elected that month on a highly restrictive property franchise. Napoleon's priority was to raise an army to face the coalition, but the law did not allow conscription and he was only able to raise about 300,000 men, mostly raw recruits and National Guards. On June 12th, Napoleon led about 124,000 men, known as the Army of the North, into Belgium, aiming to drive a wedge between Wellington's army of 112,000 British, German and Dutch troops and Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher's force of 130,000 Prussians and Saxons. After engagements at the Battle of Ligny and Battle of Quatre Bras, Napoleon confronted Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18th. Wellington's army withstood repeated attacks by the French until, late in the afternoon, Blücher's Prussians arrived in force on Napoleon's right flank. The coalition forces broke through Napoleon's lines, inflicting a devastating defeat. Napoleon returned to Paris and found that the legislature had turned against him. Realizing that his position was untenable, he abdicated on June 22nd in favor of his son. He left Paris 3 days later and settled at Josephine's former palace in Château de Malmaison. By June 28th, the Prussian army was at Senlis, just north of Paris. When Napoleon heard that Prussian troops had orders to capture him dead or alive, he fled to Roquefort, Charente-Maritime, considering an escape to the United States. However, when he found that British ships were blockading the port, he surrendered to Frederick Louis Maitland on HMS Bellerophon on July 15, 1815.